네, 저희 곧 이어서 기조연설 시작할
We are going to begin the keynote session shortly. And so, ladies and gentlemen, please bear with us for a few minutes. And you can use the interpreter device if you need the service. So now, with a very successful opening ceremony, we'll move on to the next session, the keynote session.
글로벌 협력이라는 주제.
So we will have the presentation and a keynote speech to be delivered by Mr. Jens Meier, the president of IAPH. Please welcome him with a big hand.
네, 박수 소리가 조금 작은 것 같아요, 여러분.
So louder, please. It's a big round of applause for our keynote speaker.
Yeah, dear President Song, dear former President and Secretary General Lim, my board colleague from the IAPH, Jean Soroka, honorable speakers, colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege for me to stay in front of you today here in the vibrant city of Busan, and many thanks also for the speeches, especially from the Mayor of Busan. Allow me first to thank you, President Song, for welcoming us to this remarkable Busan International Port Conference in the 13th edition. It is always great to come together with the family, with the practical people, with universities, but also with the associates or cadets and universal students. I think that's a great moment for all of us. And Busan is not just a port city, it is a place where history, innovation and resilience converge. It reminds us that ports are more than just infrastructure. We are gateways for goods, for ideas, but also for people. Under the theme of this year's conference, an innovative leap towards sustainable voyages, I invite you, imagine something with me. Imagine that all of us here are a crew or crew members aboard a shared vessel, journeying into our collective future. The question for us is, how do we want this voyage to look like? We are all aware of the scale of our responsibility, I believe. Maritime transport moves more than 90% of global trade. It is the invisible backbone of the global economy, delivering food, medicine, energy, and technology for billions of people. Yet this comes at a cost. Our sector also contributes around 3% of global greenhouse emissions. Ports themselves are significant energy consumers. Our very industry that connects the world is now being called to do its part to help preserve it. Alongside our challenging climate, we are also facing rapid technology advancements such as automation, artificial intelligence, which brings new cybersecurity demands, as you have already mentioned. At the same time, geopolitical tensions and the resulting supply chain disruptions are reshaping our industry. So the question is, will we simply adapt to these changes, or will we take bold steps, innovative leaps, as mentioned here, toward a more sustainable, resilient and forward-looking maritime sector? If anyone doubts that transformation is possible, they only need to look at Korea. The Port of Busan is a remarkable story of transformation. What began as a modest trading hub between Korea, China and Japan evolved into a lifeline during the Korean War, a literal safe haven. It stood firm, receiving war materials, humanitarian aid, and processed food, helping to stabilize the economy in a time of crisis. This history reflects what ports inherently carry, not just goods, but responsibility. Responsibility in crucial moments, and even more so, responsibility for the or for our future. Today, Busan is the 6th busiest container port worldwide, handling more than 22 million TEU annually. That is not just trade, it's a reflection of vision, perseverance, and strategic investment. And Korea's maritime sector continues to lead by example. My example is Hyundai Heavy Industries. They are developing LNG and ammonia dual-fuel engines for large container vessels, and this is advancing shipbuilding technologies and as a leader in the world shipbuilding market, bringing real progress to shipbuilding industry. These efforts stand as proof that innovation and sustainability are not opposites, but partners that can grow together. Let me come back to our voyage and the very basis of it. Every successful voyage needs 3 things: a compass, a crew, and the wind. First, the compass. For our industry, from my point of view, the compass is innovation. It points us towards smart ports, digital twins, autonomous vessels, and so on. Innovations helped us improve efficiency, reduce emissions, and prepare for future challenges. It is our guiding instrument for shaping our future. Without, we remain anchored in the past. Second, the crew. No ships sail without its crew. Our crew is the international port community united in the IAPH. The community is not just a phrase, it is a living network of cooperation and shared purpose, connecting ports worldwide for more than 7 decades already. This year, we celebrate the 70th anniversary of IAPH, a milestone that will be honored at the upcoming International Port Conference in Kobe from October 7th to October 9th. Through IAPH, we foster global collaboration, exchange best practices, and build coalitions that transcend borders. Third, the wind. The wind is the momentum and our dedication to move forward. It comes from leadership and courageous investments, but first and foremost, from the willing of working together and collaborate. As it also seen here at the Busan International Port Conference for more than a decade now, collaboration is key for us, and it will speed us up, align our compass and crew with a clear purpose. To move forward on our journey, we must be bold. Small steps will be not enough. We must take 4 strategic leaps to come closer to the destination of our voyage. First, the technological leap, driving forward digitization and smart port infrastructure. We must accelerate digital transformation. Advanced technologies like artificial intelligence, also quantum computing, but also drones are able to serve as a basis for efficient and future-proof ports. Imagine an international port community that shares real-time data about supply chain disruptions and anticipates delays before they happen. This is achievable if we commit. Second, the green leap, fostering sustainable and climate-neutral port development. Decarbonization is urgent. We must invest in clean fuels, electrification, as you mentioned already, shore power, and also energy-efficient technologies. Collaboration with innovators like those here in Korea is key. The leap will define if we as ports become key actors for global energy transition. Third, the resilience leap, strengthening the resilience and crisis resistance of ports. Ports must be ready for disruptions, as we have seen, from pandemics to geopolitical tensions to climate events. We need robust infrastructure, agile governance, and coordinated emergency systems. Resilience means not just surviving, but adapting and thriving. And resilience needs also redundancy. Fourth, the human leap, investing in the expertise of people, expertise campaign, promoting of young people. So that's also a great chance today to have students in the room. Technology alone is not enough. We must empower people to make use of these advanced technologies. We need to train and inspire the next generation of maritime professionals. The future of our industry depends on human talent and leadership. These four leaps, technological, green, resilient, and human, are distinct, but they share a common goal, a resilient and innovative maritime future. As I began my second term as IAPH President in November, I'm strongly committed to take these leaps, and I'm honored to renew my dedication to advancing our shared goals within the IAPH community. Finally, let us return to the image we began with. How do we want the voyage on our shared vessel to look like? Our compass is innovation, our crew is our global community, and the wind is in our sails is our shared momentum and the dedication we have for our joint goals. The voyage ahead will be challenging, but history teaches us that the boldest leaps are taken not in calm waters, but in times of challenges. So let us, here in Busan, commit not to cautious steps, but to these innovative leaps. Let us show that ports and shipping can be not only the backbone of trade, but leaders in sustainability and innovation. For now, I wish all of us an inspiring voyage here at the Busan International Port Conference, and I really hope to see you all again in October in Kobe at the IAPH World Ports Conference to continue our conversations from today. Thank you very much for your attention for the moment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Meier.
And bon voyage, right? 네, 좋습니다.
Thank you very much for such a great keynote speech as highlighted by President Song of Busan Port Authority. Decarbonization, digital transformation, and the importance of human talents have been highlighted once again. Thank you very much for such an insightful keynote speech. Why don't we give him another round of big applause once again?
Thank you, Mr. Meier. 네, 이제 저희 본격적으로
Then let us move on to the first session of BIPC 2025. Under the theme of container shipping today and tomorrow, we have presentations and discussion in this session. In this session, we will engage in an in-depth discussion on the ships in the global shipping market and the outlook for the container shipping sector. We will begin with a presentation by Dr. Lars Jensen, CEO of BIPC Maritime, followed by Mr. Tan Hua Joo, co-founder of Analytiker. The session will be chaired by Mr. Eun-hyuk Lee, Director of International Logistics Support at Busan Port Authority. Following the presentations, a panel discussion will take place. As soon as the stage is arranged and ready, we will invite the chair speakers to the stage. And after the presentations, we will have discussions. And if you have any questions later, please scan the QR code. I think the stage is ready. I'd like to invite the chair and the speakers onto the stage. Please welcome them with a warm round of applause.
welcome our moderator as well as our speakers and panelists. 네, 지금 무대 위로 올라오시고 계시는데요. 타이밍이 약간 안 맞았잖아요. 다시 한번 큰 박수.
So, ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause, please. Now I will hand over the microphone to the moderator.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to session 1, container shipping, today and tomorrow. Well, the world of container shipping can sometimes feel like a giant puzzle, constantly shifting, full of surprises, and never short of challenges. And today, we are lucky to have two these gentlemen who spent their careers helping make us make sense of that puzzle. So let me introduce Lars Jensen, CEO of Vespucci Maritime first. Lars has a rather unusual background for someone in shipping. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics. Wow, theoretical physics. That sounds difficult. Maybe that's why he sees patterns and future trends in ways others don't. Back in February 2017, he published a book called Liner Shipping 2025. In that book, he predicted that by 2025, this year, the number of global mega carriers would shrink to about 8 carriers. At that time, there were 17 global carriers. And I joined this company, joined this industry, 2005. At that time, there were 20 global carriers. But here we are now in 2025. And his bold prediction turned out to be right. And that gives you an idea of how insightful and foresight, how much foresight he has. And by the way, he even created a training tool called Liner Game, using Lego bricks to explain how this industry works. So he has both the sharp mind of an analyst and the creativity of a teacher. Now, we have Hua Joo, co-founder of Linerlytica. Hua Joo has been tracking this industry since the mid-90s, and is best known as the creator of the Alpha Liner services. I think that many of you here read Alpha Liner reports. He's the creator. He worked at the company for many years. He made all the reports. For over a decade, if you wanted to know what was really happening in the shipping industry, especially container industry, fleet orders, carrier capacity, and the alliance moves, his reports were the go-to reference. Now he founded Linerlytica in Singapore. Through their Linerlytica today, he continues to provide sharp, no-nonsense analysis that many of us rely on. So with Lars and Hua Joo, we have two guides who can take us through the present and future of container shipping. One with a physicist's eye for big patterns and long-term shifts, and the other with unmatched depth in data and market intelligence. So please join me in giving them a warm round of applause. Lars, you go first.
Thank you for that most kind and generous introduction. I'll see if I can hopefully live up to it. You actually mentioned the Liner Shipping 2025 book. I am working on the next one. It's going to be Liner Shipping 2035, so likely coming out here in the beginning of the new year. With that being said, when we're looking at the long-term patterns, it is sometimes hard not to drown in the immediate problems. I'm going to do my level best to drown you in problems in the next couple of slides. But before I do that, I want to take you back in time slightly. Remember 2009? 2009, when this industry was in the throes of the financial crisis. Everybody was bleeding money, demand had absolutely crashed. What is going to be of this industry? Then we had a huge comeback in 2010 and everything once again looked completely unmanageable. Yet, my perspective also at the time was the financial crisis was not all that relevant. It masked an underlying shift that was much more important. At the time when we had the financial crisis, this industry was going to change anyhow. We were going from an industry that for decades had shown extremely rapid growth compared to global economics and was maturing, so it would be a period we entered of lower growth, of consolidation. That was the important part. the upheaval around the financial crisis was not. I find right now we are standing at a similar point. The crisis this time seemingly takes a little bit longer. First we had the COVID, we had the Red Sea crisis, now we have a trade war, all seemingly coming on top of each other. But the real material underlying shift here is the geopolitical shifts that we are seeing. That will fundamentally change this industry and the competitive nature of it. I'm going to get back to that towards the end of my presentation, but I wanted to set that scene. This industry is not in a crisis. It will definitely thrive for many, many years to come. But that does not mean all stakeholders in the industry will thrive if they don't change and take up these challenges. So let's have a look at what some of these challenges are. Obviously, we could spend the entire day talking about the US trade war. I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to mention here is the most important part. The most important part is the unpredictability. That is the key. That is what is creating major shifts right now. Hypothetically, let's say the US can come out in April and say we're going to put 25% tariff on all countries in the entire world, done it and stick with it. If that was the case, supply chains would have changed already. Importers would have changed some of their sourcing patterns. There would be investments accommodating this new regime. But the constant changes, pauses and restarts, the unpredictability, means that most of the shippers out there are stuck in a limbo where it is effectively impossible to make reasonable medium and long-term plans until we get stability. It's the stability that is creating all the challenges we have in the market. As long as that happens, we are not going to get long-term planning. We are not going to get major, sustainable long-term shifts. But mind you, I'm going to show you numbers in a moment as well. This is not a global phenomenon. This is a US phenomenon. The rest of the world is actually growing very nicely, as we shall see in a moment. We also have to add just a few words on the Red Sea crisis. Yes, it is still a crisis in the sense that the major shipping lines still are going around Africa in order not to get the big ships shot at. Until that is resolved, we will continue to see slightly more than 10% of the global fleet capacity tied up going around Africa. This underpins a reasonable strength, supply and demand in the market, as long as that goes on. For now, there is no time horizon given developments in the Middle East. I will be surprised if anything positive happens here this side of mid-2026. So this is going to be stuck with us for a long time. On the topic of unpredictability is also some of these new fees that are coming over to the US here in the middle of October. This was also one of these roller coaster rides, with first a proposal that would have been exceedingly onerous, not just on the shipping industry, but also on anybody shipping cargo to and from the US. Then there was a change, making it a lot less onerous, but right now with a huge emphasis that's going to impact especially COSCO and OOCL. Before the implementation date on October 14th, there's still a lot of details missing, and as of just 3 days ago, there was a message coming out from the US Trade Representative. The details are not ready yet, which might be true, or it might be, that will be my interpretation, that maybe there's something going on behind the scenes, that there might be smaller changes yet again before we ever get to October 14th. At the end of the day, it just adds to the unpredictable nature of the environment we're operating supply chains in, and as long as we have that unpredictability, what we see is supply chains that are being changed tactically, day to day or week to week, but not materially with a long-term emphasis. Now, I promised you to put a few numbers on, and what is interesting is if we look at global demand, or rather if we split it up, because what you see here, the blue line is container demand growth for all containers going to and from North America. The orange line is the rest of the world. Let's keep in mind, the rest of the world is about 80% of all containers being moved. North America, 20%, give and take, depending on how you calculate it. And the numbers are very easy to interpret. The trade war impacts US demand negatively. It does not impact the rest of the world as it is right now. So in this overall narrative where there is, granted, a lot of emphasis on the trade war because of the unpredictable nature, that doesn't mean that the entire shipping sector is in a crisis. Absolutely not. If anything, we see phenomenally strong growth. We're actually seeing growth twice as strong as what you would usually expect for the rest of the world. So global trade is actually doing fine, except for North America, which also gives us hope for where this industry is moving going forward. If you dig it down just a slight bit and try to look at the individual regions, because fine, it might be that there were also soft spots in other regions. Well, at least the numbers tell a different story. What I'm looking here is growth. I look at container movements from April to July, July being the latest numbers for loadings. So basically the whole period where the US trade war has been going on, compared to the same period last year. And the findings are simple. The only region in the world that is seeing a decline in both imports and exports is North America. We don't see that anywhere else in the world. Again, underscoring the point that yes, the US economy is extremely important. It's the largest player in the world, but it does not make up the entire world. The entire world is doing just fine. If we try to then take that into context, how does that impact freight rates? How are we making money in this industry? Again, we see this split. We see an Asia-Europe that basically developed more or less as predicted. What you're seeing here are rates over the last 2 years. So first we see the extreme spikes in 2024 driven by the Red Sea crisis. Coming into 2025, what was the expectation? The expectation would be that we would again see solid rates, but nowhere near as solid as in 2024, simply because we got a 10% capacity injection. A lot more ships came on stream, so the shortages of last year would not be repeated this year. That's exactly what we saw play out in Asia-Europe, and now rates are coming down because we're entering the slack season. Not really a big surprise. The Pacific is the interesting one to watch. Not so much for the magnitude of the spikes, but for the extreme brevity. Here's my take on what transpired in recent months, especially on the rates. First, trade war started, especially against China, leading to a significant drop in demand. What does a significant drop in demand mean? It means a drop in rates. It means a bunch of canceled sailings. That's really a no-brainer. Then we saw the pause on China all of a sudden on tariffs. That led to an instant boost in demand, especially for cargo that had already been manufactured. It was just waiting in China to be shipped, waiting for that trigger point saying, now the tariffs will go away. But, and this was the interesting part, when that boom started, a large amount of US importers also basically said, that's great, we're going to move this, and we're going to front-load cargoes, we're going to move this before the pause expired. But before we ever got to that point, they changed their minds. Because this is where more uncertainty entered. Now we have uncertainty whether these tariffs are constitutional or not. I don't know whether they are or not, but it adds uncertainty into the mix. So suddenly, what seemed to be a good idea, let's front-load cargo, was replaced with a mentality, let us just move what is absolutely necessary for our business, because we have no idea what transpires down the line. So that boom evaporated as rapidly as it was actually created, creating these massive shifts both in demands and in pricing, making for a very, very erratic trading environment. Let me just skip these two for a second, because what I want to do is to say, fine, we have all of these challenges in front of us. We're basically standing in the middle of a brush fire when it comes to the US, but we're doing great everywhere else. Where is that going to lead us when we then look further ahead, when we look beyond the immediate problems? And there are three elements I want to focus on because they are going to be massively important for this industry. The regulation, it's the decarbonization, and it's geopolitical constraints. We've already addressed it to some point in terms of the regulations, especially when talking about the US tariffs. This is not going to go away anytime soon. The challenge we are seeing now is the speed with which some of this regulation changes, because this industry cannot react at that speed. Again, let me use a practical example, this short spike, late May, early June. Prior to that, carriers had canceled sailings because there was not a lot of demand, which made sense. It's relatively quick to cancel a sailing. Then suddenly, from one day to the next, there's a pause and demand shoots up. Carriers try their level best to put in more capacity, but that takes time. You cannot magically teleport a ship back into the ports where you suddenly need it. If I look at the hard numbers, it took around 3 weeks from the point where you could instantly see the carriers wanted to put in more capacity until that capacity physically was on site. The problem was, during those short 3 weeks, that market sentiment had changed. So we are at a point where these rapid changes are exceedingly difficult for the industry in the physical reality to react to fast enough. And that creates some of these extreme spikes up and down that's going to be difficult to deal with. My expectation is we're going to see more of these events as we proceed ahead. The next thing is also shippers might find this hard to deal with. Again, just one practical example. The penalty tariffs that came on India, not the 25% reciprocal, but the additional 25%. Now, every time these tariffs are announced, there are usually 2 deadlines that are important. There's an implementation deadline. In the case of these Indian penalty tariffs, that was August 27th. So if you load prior to August 27th, that's fine, you're not subject to tariffs. But here's where the second deadline comes in, provided the cargo arrives in the US prior, in this case, to September 9th. I don't see any ships capable of sailing from India on August 26th and making it to the US on September 9th. That's just not how fast ships are sailing. So this is the first example where you literally had shippers that were impacted by a new tariff on cargo they had already loaded prior to even knowing this was coming. So it's not just the carriers that can't react fast enough, it's also the shippers. This, again, fosters an environment that becomes a lot more tactical and a lot less strategic. And this is liner shipping. We're used to planning out schedules, but what this environment is fostering is a move that will favor shipping lines that don't really have these large schedules set in place, but operate not quite the way we see trampers do on bulk and tankers, but somewhat close to it. And the US tariffs are not the only one where this is happening. The Middle East Red Sea crisis has fostered the exact same thing. We have seen the advent and the growth of niche carriers in the Middle East that are doing exactly this as well, taking opportunity and servicing a market that is exceedingly volatile by taking more tactical decisions rather than strategic decisions. This is changing the competitive landscape of the market. And here, partly coming back to where I also started this, the major shift in the market back in 2009, coming into the decades of the tens, that was favoring the large carriers. This is also why we saw the consolidation, because the market has stabilized, it was calm, it could be planned. We are now entering an era where the markets are becoming more volatile. This increasingly favors new competitors coming in that can act in a much more agile way than the large carriers can. This is going to shift not the entire global liner setup, but it's going to change the competitive balance. We're likely going to see more smaller regional players come in. And especially, and that's not just from the regulations, also from the point when I'm going to talk about in a moment on the geopolitical shifts, a large part of the growth is going to come from the greater Asian region, so Far East, Southeast Asia, Indian subcontinent, Middle East. You already have a large number of regional players here. This is a playing field that will favor some of these carriers, and not to the same degree the large global carriers. And that's going to change the way we operate. The second thing that's going to change, but it's going to change slowly, is on decarbonization. Of course, sorry, I should have said 2028 for implementation and not 2027, my bad. We have the meeting coming up in MEPC here in mid-October. Will we get a tax on marine fossil fuels? Yes, I know they call it something else than a tax, but effectively that's what it is, in order to drive decarbonization. So far, the baseline is we are likely to see that come in, despite some of the criticism coming out recently. The one thing I see here, though, is I'm not necessarily convinced it will go as rapidly as we would all like it to happen. Again, we come back to the physical reality. Ships tend to have a lifespan of 20, 25 years. Still, the majority of the order book of vessels being built, they are for good old-fashioned fossil fuels. They're not for green fuels. So this is going to take a long time. It's going to cost money. And that's also why the decision here in mid-October is critical. We can be as idealistic as we want, but the reality, at least when I talk also to a lot of shippers out there, nobody really wants to pay unless they absolutely have to. So if we don't get this scheme in place, the decarbonization process is going to be exceedingly long because there's not that willingness to then invest. The third element is the geopolitical constraints. We come from a shipping world which, sure, with a few modifications, but for decades we have been used to that nationality really doesn't matter that much. I can have a company from any country, the vessel can be owned in any country, flagged in any other country, I can service every country in the world by and large, which is how global shipping has become enormously effective, both in liner shipping but also in bulk and tramp. That to some degree is also going to change because geopolitics is changing. These are just a few examples where nationality begins to play a role just within the last few months. So we had US penalties on Chinese ships. Then we had a crisis between Pakistan and India, meaning ships that are called Pakistani ports suddenly couldn't call India, forcing a complete revamping of these services that called especially Pakistan, basically reducing Pakistan's connectivity to the rest of the world significantly. Then we had no Israeli vessels can now go into Turkey. We can't have Turkish vessels go into Israel. We suddenly couldn't move cargo between Thailand and Cambodia. And over in the US, they placed 25 container vessels on the sanctions list because they were linked to Iran. These are just a few examples, but it's going very rapidly in terms of changes. And this means the notion we had for decades that it doesn't matter where the shipping line is located, it doesn't matter where ships are flagged, it doesn't matter where we move from and to, everything is fungible. That is likely gonna, if not change fundamentally, then at least be modified significantly. This is going to matter, which again fosters competition that favors some of the more regional carriers rather than the large carriers. Mind you, this does not mean global trade will stop. Absolutely it will not. It will grow solidly, but it changes the competitive landscape. It changes who this favors and who this disfavors, making this a much more complicated setup, which by the way also creates more work for logistics intermediaries, because complexity breeds more complex supply chains, which breeds more work for the intermediaries, which at the end of the day increases cost in the supply chain as well. That is also where we are going. So that's where we're going long term. Then let me bring it back and finish it up here. I can see I'm almost running out of time as well. What are some of the issues that we should really watch out for here in this slight few months of 25 and into 26? A few things to watch out for. Potential bottlenecks in US customs. They are the ones that are charged with enforcing all of these rapidly changing rules. I was about to say good luck with that because that's going to be challenging. I would not be surprised if at some point over the next year we run into a US recession, which of course will then lead to a further reduction on demand on US trade lanes. I would also expect more regional conflicts to flare up. Can I predict which ones? No, I absolutely cannot. Why can I not predict that? Am I not supposed to do that? Well, let's all think back just to the beginning of 2025. How many here expected that we would suddenly see border skirmishes between Thailand and Cambodia during this year? How many expected to see an almost shooting war between India and Pakistan? This sort of came out of nowhere. This is the result of a world that is increasingly unstable. It's a result of a world where different countries are changing their positions. So we are likely to see more regional conflicts. Again, it's not going to stop trade, but it's going to make it more complicated, more difficult to deal with, more tactical decisions needs to be made. The final one I want to end with, I can see I got 9 seconds, so I'm going to run a little bit over time on seconds, is the one to watch out for. There is an investigation ongoing in the US by the Federal Maritime Commission. Maybe simplified slightly, the question is quite easy. Is there unfair competition based on flag states against US trade? I can already guess the answer. The answer I would tend to say is yes, of course there is. In this industry, flag state competition has been normal for literally centuries. There's a reason why we call somebody flags of convenience. So there are definitely competitive advantages and disadvantages depending on flag. That really is a no-brainer. The reason why we should watch it is not for the results of that analysis, is for the question, when that comes out, what action, if any, will the US government take? That one is unpredictable, but I would make a comparison. The USTR fees I mentioned earlier, they are the results of a similar investigation. Back under the previous administration, there was another study that was initiated. Is there unfair competition from Chinese shipping? And again, the answer is a no-brainer, because there was also unfair means if there are, for example, state subsidies. So the answer was a no-brainer. Yes, there's unfair competition. That report came in December. So from the point where that report came out until now, the USTR, which is the consequence of that report, goes into effect, it took 10 months. So let's see what comes out of the FMC report, and then we should have an expectation that potentially 10 months later, that will be sometime likely towards second half, maybe towards the end of 2026, we might see additional constraints or fees or whatever form that might take, which again brings more challenges in and underscores my point from before that nationality is going to matter more in shipping going forward than we have been used to for decades. I have used my time and more than that, so I will stop here, but hopefully leaving you with the feeling that the world is not coming to an end. Global trade is growing strongly. Yes, we have problems in one country in the world. It happens to be a large country, but the rest of the world is doing just fine, and it will continue to do fine, but the competitive landscape will change in nature over the next 10 years due to these geopolitical shifts. Thank you.
Right, so for today, I want to cover the key developments in the three sectors within the container shipping market, starting with the port sector, followed by the ocean shipping segment, and lastly, the shipbuilding sector. And I'm covering all three because all of these three sectors are very important in the Korean context. But I also see significant developments within each of these sectors that is going to change the landscape of these segments very significantly in the next couple of years. And I therefore think it's very useful to analyze what is happening in the market today. Now, if I can start with the port sector, what I've listed on this slide here are the top 41 in fact, of the top global port operators in the world. And I think it's very useful to highlight what is going on in this segment here. And again, in the Korean context, despite the fact that Busan Port is the 7th largest container port in the world, and HMM is the 8th largest container shipping line in the world, in this list, there is only one Korean name, and that is HMM, and it lies in number 30 position. And I think this is very important to consider, given that if Korea is serious about building its global presence, I think it's important to look at what is developing in this segment. Now, what I've done is to divide each of these operators into three broad segments. We have, firstly, the global port operators. This would be names like PSA, Hutchison, DP World, for example. And followed by the second sector, which is the carrier operators, which is at this point primarily APM terminals, but also increasingly we're seeing the increased dominance of MSC in this sector as well. But what is interesting is that within this last 20 years, the top 4 players hasn't changed at all. Because since the early 2000s, the top 4 names in this list has remained constant. And that has been PSA, Hutchison, DP World, and APM terminals. But this is going to change very dramatically in the next few years. And again, it's also interesting to see that the share of the global carriers has not really changed all that much in this last 20 years. Its share of the global port throughput only increased by 1%. in this last 20 years. Unlike the global port operators, the global port operator share has grown from 24% at the beginning of the 2000 decade to where it is today. It's more than 30%. But again, as I said, this landscape is going to change quite dramatically because the main development here is the acquisition of Hutchison Ports Terminals by MSC. And that is going to significantly change that landscape in the years ahead. One of the key reasons why the carriers have not been able to grow its share is that I think it's important to remember that prior to 2020, the shipping lines does not have the balance sheet capacity to grow its container port business. And next year, I think it's very important, next year is going to be the 10th year anniversary of the bankruptcy of Hanjin. Some of you may still remember the name, but again, it's very important to realize that the shipping lines until this last 5 years were all in a very poor financial state. Now, obviously, this has changed. Since 2021, the earnings of the container shipping lines have been massive, and almost all of them are right now sitting on a significant cash reserves with nowhere to spend it, and the ports is going to be one of the key areas that the lines are going to invest in. And again, this is very important to consider, especially given the growth of MSC in this segment. And this also has significant lessons for the other carriers in the top 10 or 12 list, because you cannot have one single player being so dominant in this segment. Now, the other thing that's going to change is that the role of the global port operators is going to change. And if once the Hutchison acquisition, if it does go through, the global operator share would start to shrink for the first time in the last 20, 30 years. And that is also quite critical because if you look at the growth of this global operators in this last 2 decades, it hasn't really been driven by the growth of the top 3 players in this sector, but rather it's been driven by the growth of the emerging global players. And again, I want to emphasize, none of them are Korean. But if you look at some of these emerging players, names such as China Merchants, Shanghai International Port Group, Adani Port, Abu Dhabi Port, and Ildrim, none of them were in the global port list 20 years ago, but today they have grown significantly to become global operators. But the problem is these global operators are now no longer able to compete as strongly and as effectively as they've done in the past, because despite the fact that they continue to bring a significant capital into this port sector, as well as their operating expertise, which they all along have been promoting, there is one element that is missing in this, which is they can't bring volumes in the same way that the shipping lines are able to. And therefore, you will see increasingly that it's the shipping lines who are operating terminals that will gain a dominant share as we go forward as well. And again, I think this, you will see this illustrated quite clearly if you look at this list here. Because once, if you look at the chart at the bottom right-hand side of this page, you will see that once the MSC acquisition of Hutchison goes through, they will become by far the dominant global port operator. And again, if you look at the combination of MSC's existing global port footprint, in addition to the Hutchison global ports, they will have a significant global footprint in the global port operations. And this will allow them to overtake the current biggest player in the shipping line operator segment, which is APM terminals. And again, it does have significant implications for the rest of the market. And again, what MSC has done or is trying to do with this acquisition of Hutchison, which is a continuation, by the way, of the earlier acquisitions that MSC has done with Bolloré 2 years ago, and also with the other new acquisitions that MSC has been taken, is to build this dominant footprint around the world, which replicates exactly what they're doing now in the ocean shipping segment. Now, if you look at the growth of MSC in terms of their global ocean shipping capacity that I show on this chart here, the growth of MSC has been significant, and this has been the most amazing development for this sector. And you contrast that against the relative lack of growth from the number 2 player today, which is Maersk. And what does that imply for the rest of the market? There is right now roughly about 12 global players still remaining. What are the rest of this top 12 list going to do in the face of the significant dominance that MSC has built? And this is a process that isn't going to end in the short term, because if you look at the current order book that MSC has, it is going to increase the lead that it has over the rest of the market by a very significant margin. And you can see that I've drawn this line up to 2030. I'm pretty sure this growth will continue well beyond that as well. And again, if you look at the list of the rest of the players in this segment, again, how each of these carriers are going to react is going to drive the market in the next couple of years. And we can see already some of this starting to show up in the numbers. If you look at, again, this list of the top 12 operators in the world, the key thing here is look at the order book that each one of them has at the moment. Currently, the order book has grown to close to 33%. That's a significantly high number. And I think it's very important to bear in mind 33%, I think, is going to be very difficult for the market to digest. And we're going to end up with a significant oversupply problem in the next couple of years. But again, even if you look at the current order book today, and again, compare the MSC order book against the rest of the competitors in the market right now, significant lead that MSC has built up and will continue to build. And this isn't even the end of it, because if you look at the list of prospective new orders, every single one of these carriers are going to add to their order book within this next couple of months. So we're not even close to the end of this current competitive war that is happening within this ocean shipping segment as well. And again, if you look at where HMM is positioned at this moment, HMM does have one of the lowest order book in the sector right now. Of course, it's not going to end there. They plan to add to this order book. But again, in terms of the larger implications for the rest of the market, I think this is very significant because in the next couple of years, we're going to see extreme competition in the market simply because the carriers have not been able to control their capacity expansion. And again, if you look at the alliance landscape that has started since the beginning of this year, what we're seeing is a continuation of this carrier competition. And so earlier, if you look at the port operator competition, that is getting very intense. But if you look at the carrier side competition, this is also getting extremely intense, especially given the formation of the new Gemini Alliance. And the formation of the alliance does have a significant implication, especially in the port of Busan, because they are adopting a strategy which the rest are not doing, which is the hub and spoke approach, which means that the number of direct calls, including at the port of Busan, is very much reduced. Now, the good news is, in my view, this is not the right strategy But unfortunately, I think Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd is stuck with this strategy and they have to push ahead. But it is also because of this formation of new alliances that is driving the current turmoil in the market. I'll show you that in a bit. But in my view, if you look at what Maersk has done, and again, bear in mind, if you look at the ocean shipping growth in the last 7 years, essentially since 2017, Maersk has stopped growing their liner shipping business. And you can see this reflected in the bottom chart here. This is the amount of capital invested within the three Maersk business segments. You have the ocean shipping, the logistics, and the port sector. And you can see almost all of the growth in new investments for Maersk has come in the logistics sector. They have not grown their ocean shipping segment, and they have also failed to grow in their port operations as well within this last 5-year period. Now, unfortunately, I think this is the completely wrong strategy, because if you look at the rate of return that Maersk has been able to achieve for each of these three segments that they're in, obviously the liner shipping segment was earning significantly higher earnings during the COVID period, and there was a mild rebound in 2024 because of the Red Sea crisis. But you can see that the margins in the ocean shipping segment have started to decline. And because of the reason that I've mentioned earlier, we could be at the start of a prolonged price war, a multi-year price war that is going to significantly affect earnings for these container carriers. But what is interesting in this chart here is the fact that the port margins has been the most consistent out of all three operating segments. And yet, Maersk has failed to grow that port segment as well. But part of the reason for that was because of their withdrawal from their Russian assets that they were forced to undertake. But the fact remains that Maersk hasn't been growing in that sector, despite the fact that that has been the most attractive and stable in terms of earnings in this last few years. And unfortunately, their focus on logistics is completely failing to deliver on any of the positive results that they have been promising to their shareholders. Again, if you look at the earnings, the margins of its logistics business, it is the poorest amongst all three segments. They have had more than 7 years to prove that this could become successful. Until today, that has not happened. And I think this has significant lessons for a lot of their competitors in this segment in terms of where they should be putting their investments in the coming years. So again, there's been significant changes in terms of what the carriers' strategies have been. But again, what this tells us is that there are very valuable lessons to be learned by looking at some of the successes and the failures. And if you compare the strategies of MSC today versus what Maersk has done, I think MSC by far has the much better strategy in the market right now. Now, in terms of where we stand in the ocean shipping cycle, obviously the COVID crisis created one of the biggest and most profitable bull run for the container shipping segment. And that, of course, ended in 2023. And fortunately for a lot of these shipping lines, they have been helped by the Red Sea crisis. Now, if we take out the 2021 to 2023 profit cycle and look at the Red Sea crisis just in isolation, that in itself would have been the single most important event for this sector in this last 50 years, because we've never seen anything before that is similar to this. None of the previous cycles that we've seen throughout our entire 50-year history has come anywhere close to what the Red Sea has achieved. Of course, in comparison to what happened during the COVID years, it may seem somewhat insignificant. But again, if you take that 3 years of COVID out of the equation, what's happening today has been extremely remarkable. And again, if you look at this from a historical perspective, this is an event that will not be repeated in our lifetime. And unfortunately, however, we are coming to the tail end of this current Red Sea bull cycle, because most of the capacity constraints that has been created by the diversions away from the Suez to the Cape has now been fully worn out, meaning that within this last 18 months since the start of the Red Sea crisis, almost all of that diversions and the capacity that it has caused has been replaced by new ships. And so from the start of this year, essentially, we are at the start of a new phase in this container shipping cycle. And unfortunately, I think the outlook for container shipping is going to be getting significantly worse. And again, what I've listed in this page here is a comparison of the earnings margins of each of the main carriers in this market. And again, you can see that on average, it does follow the overall trend. But if you drill down into the details of this, what is very surprising somewhat is that the gap between the top performers and the bottom performers has been extremely large, and it is significantly larger compared to previous cycles that we've seen. If you look at the latest earnings for the second quarter of this year, the bottom carrier was almost losing money, and that was ONE at just 1% margin. But what is also important to note here is, again, the Gemini partners, Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk, has failed to deliver despite the implementation of the new alliance that they've had. And it's not just a one-off underperformance. You can see that Maersk in particular has been at the bottom of this cycle, of this list for the last 5 years. And again, that points to an ultimate failure in their current strategy. And if you look at the top of this list, most of the names here has been Asian names. And I think this has not been a coincidence. The Asian carriers have benefited from the growth in the Asian trades, in particular in the Trans-Pacific trade in the last couple of years, compared to the European names in this list, who tends to be a lot more focused in Europe, which has been underperforming for this last few years. And therefore, we continue to see the dominance of the Asian carriers in the list. But unfortunately, I think the next couple of quarters and potentially next couple of years, we're going to see extreme price competition. And what is driving this is what you can see here, the very high vessel order book that the shipping lines have been building, especially since the end of 2021. You can see that there has been a continuous increase in terms of the new ship orders. And right now, the order book has risen to close to 33%. And that is the highest level that we've seen since the financial crisis of 2009. Now, you may think that if you compare the current order book ratio to what we were at back in 2008, when the order book was as high as 55% at that point, the 33% may not look that frightening. Now, the problem with that is that the environment that we were back in the early 2000s is entirely different from where we are today. Because if you compare global container throughput growth in the early 2000s, annual growth rate of the container volumes globally was more than 10%. Right now, if you look at the more recent history, annual growth rates of container volumes has slowed down to only 4%. And given the geopolitical climate, especially with the US tariffs, for the next couple of years, this 4% growth rate may not even be achievable as well. So in the light of a significantly reduced global demand environment, and you have an order book that is significantly higher than any point in the last 15 years, I think that's going to create a significant oversupply in this market that could end up very badly for the shipping lines. And again, if I can highlight what this means in terms of new ship deliveries, in terms of new supply that's coming in, it's going to peak in 2028 at a level that we have never seen before. And if you look at the percentage growth in 2028, we're going to get potentially a net supply growth rate of more than 8.5%. That is a significant number, again, considering that global demand growth in the last decade has only been at 4%. But the other thing important to note here is that even the 8.6% growth that we're seeing for 2028 is coming after assuming that there's going to be a significant increase in vessel scrapping, which we have assumed here. Now, that may or may not happen because, again, if you look at vessel scrapping in the last 5 years, it's at an historical low rate. And even this year, despite the significant volatility in the freight market, we're still seeing very low scrapping levels up until today. And I am assuming that the scrapping rate will have to increase given the significant new supply that is coming online. There is still big question marks about when and if this is going to happen. Because one key question is, will there be sufficient scrapping capacity to take out so many ships? That has not been proven. And again, if you look at the worst year of container shipping in its last 20 years, the worst year was in 2016. 2016, again, was the year that Hanjin went bankrupt. And in that year, the total amount of ships that were scrapped was only around 680,000 TEUs. We are assuming that we need to scrap up to 1 million TEUs in the next few years. And that's going to be a significant challenge for the market as well. So again, in summary, I think the market is poised to face a significant oversupply problem. And I think this is going to be a multi-year problem that will take quite a number of years to resolve. Now, in terms of the impact on demand, again, as I said, given the current geopolitical environment, there has been significant turbulence in the market. But one thing which I want to point out, especially in relation to the numbers that Lars has shown, yes, there has been a drop in US demand, but his numbers ended in June. And that is missing what's happened in the last 2 months, because if you look at July and August, the numbers, the US import numbers has in fact picked up very significantly, and in fact July was a peak for a large number of ports, including the port of LA. July was the single highest month for the port. What this means is that the elasticity of demand for US container imports is actually very low. And again, the numbers, if you aggregate for the last, say, 12 months, US demand, despite the imposition of tariffs, has not collapsed. In fact, it remains very resilient. And that has been a key factor in this market. And what's driving this, again, is the fact that the US elasticity of demand is extremely low. And we all know why. because the US doesn't have alternatives to buy from. They have to continue to import. And of course, what this will translate to is increased inflation. We haven't seen the full impact of the inflationary impact of the tariffs on the US consumer, but this is something that will be inevitable. It will continue to be played out in the months ahead. So again, I think what is critical here, especially if you look at the relative tariff levels, what I'm showing here is the list of the total imports by country into the US and the tariffs that each of them has. And what is important here, and I think this is a point that a lot of the Asian countries are missing here. Again, the first point is US demand is inelastic. They cannot change in the short term. They have to continue to buy from Asia in particular. The key here is the Chinese tariffs, because for the rest of Asia, it's not really critical whether you're at 15 or 20 or 21%. As long as your tariff levels are lower than China, I think you are relatively protected. And you can see in the case of most of the Asian countries, if you look at the year-on-year growth for the first 8 months of this year, there has been significant growth in almost all of Southeast Asia, especially in Vietnam. The growth in Vietnam volumes to the US was almost 30%. Now, clearly, there's going to be continued decoupling in the trade between China and the US, and you can see that the Chinese volumes are down. But again, they have not collapsed, because a 3% drop in Chinese exports is still a very healthy number if you look at the Chinese volumes. But what is more important, if you look at the longer term trend, is that the Chinese volumes to the US, although it hasn't grown, it also has not dropped or collapsed in any significant manner. But in the meantime, again, if you look especially in Vietnam, but also places like Thailand, Indonesia, almost all of them are seeing renewed growth. And this is despite the imposition of the new tariffs since April of this year. Now, of course, in the Korean context, Korea is one of the countries that is seeing a decline in US volumes, partly because of the higher tariffs relative to its neighbors. But again, you got to look at this from a longer term context, because Korean volumes is still on a positive trajectory if you ignore the year-over-year growth numbers for this year. So again, what is going to continue with this situation is the continued decoupling of China and the US, but this is only going to lead to further growth in the rest of Asia, given, again, the fact that there is very little elasticity in US demand. I'm going to end with the last 2 pages here, just very quickly, a few words on shipbuilding. You are all aware of what the USTR action against Chinese shipbuilding is. It is going to start from 14th of October. All Chinese-built ships more than 4,000 TEUs will have to pay a very high port service fee. Most of the carriers have started to move their Chinese-built ships out of the US, except for COSCO primarily, because even if they don't use Chinese-built ships, they will still have to pay that penalty, given the way that the USTR fee is being imposed. But what I want to point out here is, despite the threat of the USTR 301 action against Chinese shipbuilding, look at what the impact has been on container ship ordering activity. A few things to note. Year to date, new ship contracts remains on track to reach an all-time high. And again, that reinforces my point about the lack of discipline by the carriers. But if you look at the breakdown between where these new ships are being built, more than 3/4 of the new capacity is still being ordered in Chinese shipyards. And what this means is that the US action against Chinese shipbuilding hasn't been working and is unlikely to succeed. And part of the reason, again, if you look at the Chinese share of new ships built in this sector, Korea has lost its dominant position. Korean shipbuilding was at its most dominant during the first decade of the 2000s. And you can see that, especially in this last 5 years, Chinese shipbuilding has come up very significantly. And even with the USDR threat, there is no damage at all to Chinese shipbuilding. And the reason I tell you is very simple. If you look at how many ships in the world today are calling at US ports, only 25% of all ships will ever call at a US port in its career. What that means is that 75% of all ships in the world will never have to be in a US port, so they will not have to pay this fee. So what that means is we're going to have at least 75% of shipbuilding still concentrated in China in the foreseeable future. And what that means is, again, the US action at this point is unlikely to damage Chinese shipbuilding in any significant way. Of course, in the meantime, Korean shipbuilding is benefiting because the Japanese and the rest of the world is not able to compete, but it is not going to be in a position to regain its dominant position that it had back 15, 20 years ago. So with that, I want to end my presentation. And again, thank you very much for the attention.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. And I have a quick announcement, so let me interrupt you for a few seconds. So for the Q&A session, we have set up an online platform. So if you have any questions, make sure you scan the QR code right up there or up on your booklet. So please make sure you type in the questions. And that's it. That was pretty quick, right? So I will now turn the microphone back to you, Director. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you, for your insightful presentations. We also adopted some innovations, so you can scan the code and put in your questions through the Inside Network. So I can view your questions here, and I ask that questions to these gentlemen. But let me summarize some of the points that these two gentlemen highlighted. So we've heard from Lars about growing turbulence in container shipping, and where political, regulatory, and environmental risks now overlap in ways that make planning harder than ever. And from Hua Joo, we've seen how structural balance of power in ports, shipping, and shipbuilding is shifting, with carriers expanding their reach and Asia's role in global trade continuing to grow. So taken together, these perspectives give us both a sense of the day-to-day uncertainties and the long-term structural changes shaping our industry. With that in mind, I'd like to open our discussion with a few questions to explore these issues further. So let me begin with questions. Now already, I received 10 questions, but I cannot cover all of them. I can only cover some of them. So first questions. It's a question to Mr. Hua Joo. So you were very critical of Musk's logistics expansion. And what lessons should carriers take away? And what do you see as the right direction for diversification?
So again, if you look at the chart that I showed earlier, the earnings of the logistics segment, not just for Maersk, but almost all logistics operators globally, has been very poor. And for Maersk to push for this strategy for this last 7-8 years has, I think, more than proven that this is not going to work. And the underlying this issue is the underlying conflict between a carrier and a logistics operator, because there is a fundamental conflict of interest. A lot of these logistics players, freight forwarders, also happen to be customers of the shipping lines. And what Maersk is trying to do with their integrator strategy is to get rid of a lot of these logistics middlemen, who happens to be also a big part of the ocean business customer segment. And this is a fundamental conflict that hasn't been resolved by Maersk, and this continues to be a problem. But again, ultimately, I think the earnings in this sector has been relatively poor, and I don't see any way this is going to change in the near term as well. So what was the second part of the question?
So what do you see the right direction for diversification?
In terms of diversification, if you look at, again, my slides earlier, I think investment in ports offers a much better return and is a better direction for a lot of these carriers to be making. And again, as I said, in the past, they did not have the balance sheet capacity to do that. Right now they have, and I think this should be the direction that a lot of them should start to pursue.
Okay, now this question is directed to Lars. The US is about to impose hefty port fees on Chinese ships and Chinese-built vessels. So what short and medium-term service adjustments do you expect carriers to make?
Well, in the short term, we're already seeing it. Hua Joo has mentioned it as well. You're seeing carriers phase out Chinese-built ships and replacing them from other trades. That's one way to reduce it. If nothing changes compared to the current one, COSCO is the only one stuck with a major problem, because they're going to have to face the high fees. My expectation, if nothing in USTR changes, would be you're likely to see COSCO adjust some of their services. If you have a Pacific Northwest service, instead of calling, say, both Seattle and Vancouver, you would call only Vancouver, as an example, and trying to reduce part of that, but also to put pressure on some of your other Ocean Alliance partners to try to share in the cost of this. The reason I'm a little bit hesitant is we still haven't seen all the underlying details, and USTR, as I mentioned 3 days ago, still don't have them. The question to ask is, that's because there might be a revision coming. There are underlying trade talks undergoing between US and China. I don't think we can fully rule out the perspective that an element of those talks might be a revision again on USTR, but that would be speculation at this point.
Okay, thank you. To Lars, on the carbon tax schedule for 2027, how realistic is enforcement? And what kinds of loopholes or circumvention strategies do you foresee emerging?
Yeah, first of all, I'm sorry for the mistyping on the slide. The implementation is from 2028 if they come out with it. As I can't remember the exact enforcement mechanism. I'm sorry, it's been a while since I read up on it, basically half a year or so ago. And yes, it is going to be a challenge, because it's obvious, even if this one is voted through with a yes, we're not going to see all countries. You clearly have the US not being there, a couple of other ones. It seems there's going to be a fairly robust mechanism. Now we are talking container shipping here. It's a different ballgame if you're over in the tramper sectors in tank and bulk. My expectation is it's going to be relatively okay enforced on most of the liner shipping trades. Will there be loopholes? Yes. Will those loopholes be used? Yes, absolutely. Well, why can I be so sure the loopholes will be used? I think looking at the European ETS is a good example, where the loophole there is obviously to try to place a port call as close to the EU as possible. And the most obvious loophole is make a call in the United Kingdom before going to the EU. And when I analyzed the new networks here, when all the new alliances came in, there was actually a slight increase in the number of either first in or last out port calls closer to the EU. That was a very long answer, but basically, will there be loopholes in the new one? Yes. Will they be used? Yes. But that does not necessarily make this a failure per se. It can still drive part of the development, but it's also one of the reasons why I remain skeptical in terms of the realism in meeting some of these deadlines there are for decarbonization.
Thank you. To Joo Tan, you highlighted MSC's growing terminal footprint. And how will this concentration of power affect competition among ports and the bargaining position of other carriers?
So what MSC has done, especially with the Bolloré acquisition that was done a couple of years back, was it gave them a significantly enlarged footprint, and that was a very brilliant move on MSC's part, because Africa used to be the background for Maersk and CMA, and MSC suddenly overtook both of them by this acquisition. And what they're doing today, or what they're trying to do with the Hutchison acquisition, is a similar move, but on a much more global scale. And I think, again, that has been a brilliant move on the part of MSC. So as to the question, what does that mean in terms of bargaining power? It significantly and strengthens MSC's bargaining power. But with or without what they're doing, just given the fact that they've grown so dominant in the ocean shipping segment, they are now almost 1/3 larger than the second place player in the world today. They have right now a highly dominant position. And this is only going to be transferred into the port sector as well. But even without that, I think MSC has built up a significant empire, which is going to be very difficult for its rivals to defend against. At the same time, unfortunately, I think if you look at the top 10 or 12 carriers, the point here is none of them is going to go away. Because unlike what Lars might argue, the consolidation in this industry has stopped. And I see very little room for further consolidation, especially given that the current geopolitical environment. I would see it to be very difficult, for example, for HMM to be taken over by a non-Korean owner. But it's the same thing with a lot of the names. If you look down the list, the Chinese will never be sold outside of China. The Taiwanese will not be sold outside of Taiwan. Even the current speculation about what's going to happen to ZIM. For those of you who have been following, there is significant speculation about the future of ZIM. I am personally not confident that there will be a solution for ZIM, because it is very hard from a non-Israeli carrier to take over ZIM, given the golden share that the government has in the line. And with the current geopolitical situation in the Middle East, it makes zero sense for any carrier or any current rival in the market to take over that company. So again, in terms of what the rest of the top global carriers can do at this point, unfortunately, the answer is all of them will have to continue to grow. And that is partly what is driving the very high ordering activity that we're seeing today. And this is a process that cannot stop. And unfortunately also, this process becomes self-reinforcing, because once you see your rivals are ordering and building more ships, the natural reaction is for you to do the same thing. And right now, because the shipbuilding capacity is getting very tight, both in China but also in Korea, that drives even more ordering, because if you wait any longer, you may not even be able to secure the shipbuilding slot for the time that you need. And this is driving this entire frenzy. And again, this is the big danger that the industry is facing at the moment.
Hey, Lars, about the comment of low possibility of more consolidation. I remember a few years back, you mentioned that some more consolidation might take place, including HMM. And what's your take on that point?
Yeah, I mean, and I still stand by that view. I mean, we have not seen a lot, especially not in recent years. And yes, all the carriers are sitting on a massive war chest of cash. But if you look ahead a number of years, I would agree with what especially if the Red Sea crisis is also resolved, and with all the new buildings we're going to go into, I wouldn't call it a massive crash of the industry. I would call it yet another cyclical downturn. We've seen them before and they hurt. The last one cost the lives of Hanjin, for example. Are we going to see it go as rapidly with carriers being insolvent this time? No, we will not, to a large degree, because they sit on these massive amounts of cash, but it will still drive a development where they will hurt very badly. Some will start to scratch their heads and say maybe something should happen. I could see a few players. I would tend to agree. HMM probably is going to stay on Korean hands. If that was not the case, Hapag would have acquired them a couple of years ago when the opportunity was there, before they were kicked out. So it's going to stay, but I would still also point to one of, you can say, my own pet hypothesis, which I will stand by. I can still see a longer term scenario where you will see a Hapag and an O&E merge up. That would also remove one from the board. Could also see a scenario where a Yang Ming would basically be rolled in, likely under an evergreen. So you could still see a little bit of consolidation up in that end. But where I see the main part of the action to take place is the small and medium-sized ones, especially all the ones that are in the greater Asian area, because that's where the growth is going to be. That's also where the opportunities are going to be for some of this consolidation to take place.
Well, is it safe to say that we had a glimpse of the book that you're going to publish in 10 years?
At least a little bit of a glimpse.
Okay. What was the name of the book about the?
So far, it's very unimaginative. So it's called Liner Shipping 2035 this time
2035.
around.
Okay. I really look forward to it. So another question is about the African rerouting. Both of you, is it going to be Is it going to be the same next year, the rerouting, or it'll be resolved? Some of the audience will.
Realistically, I don't see this be resolved until, again, as long as we have the crisis going on, you're still looking 6 months out. Why the 6 month mark? One thing to note, for example, is we had a period of 6 months this year with no attacks on commercial ships. I mean, we had attacks in December, and then there were really no attacks until we got to July. But that was an insufficient period to convince the major shipping lines to start to reroute. Also because, if you look at it, the key risk here is the fear of being targeted. And as long as the Houthis consistently, multiple times a week, are sending missiles and drones, they're actually now sending them at Israel, they have the capability, so the risk is there. So as long as that is a genuine risk, the carriers will continue. Now, mind you, the carriers, of course, also know that once the dam breaks, so to speak, and it becomes safe, they will all go back through. This is going to be a relatively rapid process. Sure, if you ask the carriers, they will say, no, it's going to be a slow and orderly process to prevent massive bottleneck problems in Europe, but realistically, it's going to be a rapid process, cause also a number of problems, and then we'll have the overcapacity. And Hua Joo did a good job at looking at the overcapacity from the order book going forward. The one thing I would point out from the overcapacity that we already have, I mean, it's just a fact, we had significant overcapacity in Q4 2023. That's why the carriers lost money in Q4 2023. And since then, now the fleet has grown 12, 11%. And even with a strong demand growth around 5%, that means however you choose to measure overcapacity at the end of 23, it is worse right now. It's just being hidden by the Red Sea crisis. So this is not going to go away in the short to medium term. And when it does, it will instantly create overcapacity.
You talked about the risks, going through the Suez Canal, the Red Sea area. But what about CMA CGM? They frequently attempt to really actually pass through Suez Canal. And what's the reason behind it?
I think there are a couple of elements to keep in mind. I mean, first of all, CMA CGM, they right now have 2 services that they do on a regular basis that goes through. They usually operate, you have a French naval escort down there. That, of course, doesn't reduce the risk to zero. But there's also another thing to keep in mind. Think what we may about the Houthis, but at least I would say over the last year, they have become better at their market intelligence in terms of aligning what they say they want to target and what they actually shoot at. That was not the case in the beginning. And CMA CGM appears not to fall within their target range in terms of what they do. A more, you can say, subjective speculation that I don't think can be dismissed in this case is, again, look at the part Lebanese background of CMA, CGM, that might also at least have some currency in that region in terms of not being seen as on the side of what the Houthis perceive as the enemy.
Well, this question is about oversupply. I literally quote it. You mentioned that shipping industry may face an oversupply of capacity in the future, which could take decades to resolve. Given this outlook, are there any strategies to ease the pressure in advance? For example, could shipping alliances coordinate the pace of future capacity deployment into the market as a way to mitigate the risks? Hans, can you?
First of all, in terms of coordinating this in alliances, I'm not sure, completely sure, but I'm pretty sure that would likely be illegal under competition rules. So if carriers suddenly start to coordinate this in some way, shape, or form. So that's somewhat unlikely to happen. Is it going to take decades to resolve? I strongly doubt that. Will it be painful? Absolutely yes. You will have the scrapping, and no, that's not going to take care of the entire problem. It will take a while to absorb, but decades, if it was to take decades, you would come to a point where you would simply see younger ships becoming scrapped or laid up as well.
One of our audiences added about questions intra-Asia container shipping. In 2030, intra-Asia's container cargo seems to be 80 million TEU, and one eye, an Asian shipping merchant, having getting too much EBIT. I thought global container shipping merchants would like to play a chicken game in intra-Asia shipping and defeat other competitors. I want to ask your opinion. Thanks.
In terms of whether the global carrier, well, here's the challenge. The intra-Asian market, especially when you get to the shorter-term distances, tend to operate on different commercial mechanisms than if you're operating, say, an Asia-Europe service. It's not to discount, clearly the global carriers also have quite a substantial footprint in intra-Asia, but it is not the same almost stranglehold as you see them have in the major deep-sea trades, because the commercial operations are different. And what we have seen, not just over the years, but also over the decades, the way you operate a global line on major deep-sea trades where your turnaround time is measured in months is not the same dynamics what it takes to be successful in operating in a lot of the intra-Asian markets. So the major carriers don't have the same advantage that they have on the major deep-sea trades, neither from the scale nor from the way they operate their processes.
Okay, actually, this question is about Gemini. Lars, do you have the same opinion with Hua Joo about the Gemini's pros and cons? Like more reliability, but they will lose market share, it will hurt their financial stability, and so on.
Yeah, I probably differ a little bit in my view on at least the concept of the Gemini setup. The way I see it is you can go to two different extremes, and we actually see two of the extremes now. You can try to be as much direct as you can. That's what MSC is doing. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean they're not doing hub and spoke. They absolutely are, but at least they're trying to go as much direct as they can. And you can go in the opposite direction, that's Gemini, and say, let's do as many and few large hubs as possible and do hub and spoke from there. Mm-hmm. And at least mathematically, when I sit down and try to run models in terms of if that is the only thing you're looking at, if you're still going to do hub and spoke. I mean, let's be clear, MSC is doing hub and spoke as well, they just do it less. If you do a hub and spoke model and you only look at what is the cost to operate the network, taking shipping costs, terminal costs into account, the need to repatriate empty containers and whatever have you, the models turn out the same every single way. The lowest cost network to operate is one with as few and as large hubs as possible. That's, you can say, the mathematical perspective. Then on top of it, of course, then comes, one thing is theory, another thing is practice. So it's all well and good that this is lower cost in theory, but can you then execute it? That's where the key is. And I think that's where Gemini has had some challenges here initially in terms of getting that one to work. Will they be able to work through those challenges? Potentially. I think part of Gemini's issue is also they have been somewhat constrained in terms of their overall combined vessel portfolio in order to actually pull this off. Mm-hmm. And clearly the Red Sea crisis which erupted after they had first initially designed this was, of course, a major spanner in the works as well.
Well, now we have to have closing questions. I think I pretty much covered the questions raised from the audience. Closing question first to Hua Joo. So if you had to name just one factor that will shape container shipping between now and 2030, what would that be?
I'm still a firm believer that this market is going to be driven by supply and demand. And there's been a lot of talk in recent years about how carriers have found a new formula to manage supply. Again, the evidence for this is simply not there, because if you look at what happened at the end of 2023, exactly the same situation, rates were falling very significantly. But add to that, this year we have a new element, and this is Gemini. And just looking at what happened since the Gemini Alliance was formed, you will notice that since April, Gemini has adopted a zero blank sailing strategy, which is highly unusual and very surprising, because even on the Trans-Pacific, when the US tariffs were first introduced and there was a significant drop in the early weeks after the tariffs were imposed, Gemini did not withdraw any capacity. And going forward, if you look at what's happening for next month in October, when the Chinese National Day holiday starts on the 1st of October, every year, the shipping lines will withdraw a significant amount of capacity during that Golden Week period. And look at what Gemini is doing. Only one blank sailing compared to the rest who are taking out multiple sailings. This, I think, is going to be a major problem for the industry to accept, because this is, I think, one of the main causes behind the recent crash in the Asia-Europe market. On the Trans-Pacific, Gemini is not as big a player compared to where they were in Asia-Europe, and what they're doing in Asia-Europe has been very damaging to the market. And so again, in terms of what is the main driver, I think that the main attention that the market needs to focus on is what is happening on both the supply side, and that is very challenging given the very high order book, and what is happening on the demand side. And again, the good news is, as I said, even with the tariffs, American demand has not collapsed. And I think this is going to continue. The threat of inflation is very real, but the threat of a recession is not so clear. Because again, with the Fed cutting interest rates and with the US administration doing everything in their power to avoid such a recession, I think the good news is it's not going to cause a significant collapse in container volumes, even with this. And I agree that the rest of the world continues to grow very significantly. And this year, if you look at where the major growth is coming from, it's not really on intra-Asia, although a lot of people are focusing on intra-Asia. The real growth, surprisingly, is in Africa, as well as in South America. These two markets have been primary drivers behind the global absorption of new supply, and I think this is going to continue as well.
Thank you. Lars, you had the closing?
Yeah, I would say when you ask for the period out to 2030, I see this as a period of positioning. This is where the carriers are positioning themselves for this new, much more diversified trade reality that we are coming into, a reality wherein our old notions that especially Trans-Pacific and Asia-Europe were the most important trades in the world, that's going to be a lot more diversified. And the reason why I peg it under the heading of it's a positioning game, that also means that once, not if, but when we get this cyclical downturn, you have a choice. You can either, as a carrier, look and say, oh my God, we're losing money, we need to do something. But at the heart of it, I think a lot of carriers will look at it differently. Say, this is an investment. It's going to be an investment in positioning for that future. So sure, it might cost us money to build up our positioning in trades X, Y, and Z, but they're going to do it nonetheless. Seen from the outside, it's going to look hard. There's going to be quite an amount of money which technically will be lost. But this is not the first time we've seen that either. I mean, if you look at basically you had a couple of decades where, at least if you measure return on investor capital versus what you make, what the cost of capital is, you were losing money for decades. And the joke in this industry was also always, why do the carriers insist on always losing money? But in retrospect, you could also argue, is it a loss of money, or is it from the perspective, once you're in, you need to stay in order to hope to reap the benefits, because if you step out, yes, then you definitely do realize your loss. So I see the coming years here, it's a positioning game between the carriers in aligning themselves with whatever the future is. And that's going to cost money, and that's going to take quite a substantial chunk out of some of these war chests. And a final comment on that, where this is going to be interesting, the carriers over the last few years have clearly had very different strategies in terms of how much of that war chest did they choose to keep in the company, and how much did they choose to pay out as dividends to the shareholders. And for this positioning game, that is clearly going to favor the carriers that kept a lot of that money inside the company and didn't pay it out in dividends.
Thank you. Now I have to pass the podium to MC, Ms. Lee. Take the podium.
Well, I'm pretty sure
예, 사실
but our wise moderator knows that we're all starving, right? So it is now time to wrap up the session. So why don't we give another big round of applause to our wonderful speaker as well as our moderator. Thank you so much. And you may go back to your seat. Thank you so much. And as mentioned, now it's time for our lunchtime, so make sure to go to the event hall because we've prepared wonderful lunch for all of you. So please enjoy the lunch. And from 1:30 in the afternoon, we'll have a special session and special lecture by Mr. Im Gi-taek, the Honorary Secretary General of the IMO. So make sure you come back before then, 1:30. 네, 식사 맛있게 하시고요, 여러분. 오후 1시 30분부터 저희 특별 강연이 준비되어 있습니다. 네, 식사 후에 다시 컨퍼런스 홀로 입장해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. 네, 점심 맛있게 드십시오. 감사합니다.